Hall University. He, good friend, also someone who is doing something that I think is important and actually very related to what we do. Last year we went to something called the Model Gary Convention. This is the 50th anniversary of the Black Political Convention in Gary, Indiana. And it was where basically Black people all over the country got together post-civil rights movement and tried to figure out in real concrete ways, where do we need to go from here? And how do we have a Black agenda that can come out of that and try to work that? He does a model convention where he gets kids from all over the region, and he's trying to get kids from all over the country to come and have that same type of conversation, but 50 years later, right? And that 50 years later becomes a lot of where we are as a team, where we are, what we do in terms of we critically think about solving problems. We critically think about how to do these things, right? So thank you to Dr. Harris first for doing this. So thank you very much. And welcome, and a big hand of welcome for him right now.
Thank you, Brother Alston. It's good to be here today with you all. I won't go long into an introduction. Let me just ask a quick question. How many of you all heard of the Gary Convention? Not the adults. How many students have you ever heard of the Gary Convention? All right. You all have heard of Mary Baraka. Who's Mary Baraka? Don't say that.
The father of the mayor?
Okay. He was saying, don't say that. Poet and a playwright. Okay. You had your hand raised too? No? All right. Poet, playwright. Was he anything else? Yes. Activist. Right. Leader. Right? All right. So now you all have to bear with me. My handwriting is horrible.
They've been dealing with mine.
Yours is horrible too?
Yeah.
Right? Bad handwriting is a sign of high intelligence. Did y'all know that? Did y'all ever read that? It's a sign of genius?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, the Gary Convention, which we're going to get to, was 1972. Right? But before we get to that moment, we're going to start in 1793. There's a whole lot of things happen between them, okay? Because we're dealing with, at the most fundamental part of education is that we try to identify and solve problems, right? So let me give you an example. If you all had a car and your car kept stopping and starting, right? What would you do with your car? Take it to what? Take it to a mechanic. Why would you take it to a mechanic? Say it again. Find the problem first, right? Identify the problem. And then you expect the mechanic to fix it, right? Because the mechanic is educated, correct? About cars, right? So educated person, we would assume, can identify problems and be able to solve those problems. So now, I'm gonna go through a long but brief history, all right? Because really, when we think about it, does 1793 seem that long ago to you? It really is not that long ago. It really isn't. It sounds like it's a long time ago, but it really isn't. If we think about it, now, I was born in 1970. I went to graduate school at Clark Atlanta University. When I was at Clark Atlanta University, there was a woman who still lived around the campus, would be around the campus, who had taken classes with W.E.B. Du Bois, right? W.E.B. Du Bois died on the eve of the March on Washington, which we have the 60th year anniversary of the March on Washington next year. He died on the eve of the March on Washington, 1963, right? He was 95 years old when he died. So I was able to see someone who had a class with W.E.B. Du Bois, who not only died in 1963, but was born in 1868. That's what I'm saying. It's not that long ago, right? For me to meet someone who had a class with someone who was born in 1868, who had been mentored by somebody named Alexander Crummell, who had been born in 1819, right? Who was a big leader. Anyway, I'm not. That's not even a part of my discussion. But it's important to understand that these links, that this time period is that long ago. So now, I'm starting in 1793 for a particular reason. 1793 was the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia, right? The yellow fever epidemic, right? Just like we got the epidemic right now, you had one in 1793 in Philadelphia. Interestingly enough, the white Philadelphians were struck first with it. And matter of fact, do you all know when coronavirus first hit? What year did the coronavirus first hit? When?
2019.
What month? November, December? When did stuff start getting shut down in this country?
March.
All right. Do you all remember when it first happened that some people were thinking black people couldn't get it?
Yep.
You remember that?
Yep.
You remember that?
Yeah.
People said that publicly and loud.
People saying that publicly,
Publicly
right?
and loud, and I was like, stop.
Right? The
Right.
magical spirit black person can't get it.
Right.
Right? Right? The yellow fever epidemic, people were saying the same thing. Black people can't get it because white people were getting it first. Right? So what happened was, black people are the ones who doing all the volunteering, going to these white homes, cleaning up stuff and getting bodies and all that kind of people dying. Because people say, well, black people can't get it. Right? But black people what? We got it. Right? But here's what's important. There's a white dude, reporter, journalist named Matthew Carey. Matthew Carey writes a thing about how black people were going to all these white homes and doing what?
Cleaning.
I don't know. We talk 1790.
Oh, stealing.
Stealing. Stealing, right? Oh, these scurrilous black people coming here, they're supposed to be doing all this, and they're stealing this and stealing that and all that kind of stuff, right? So there's a problem, right? Now, why do I go on all this? Because what impact could that have possibly on public policy? Say it again. Stigmatizing black people. Okay, how does that impact public policy? This is Philadelphia, 1793. How could that possibly impact?
Because people are going to want to be less willing to get the help when they get.
That's right. That's right, right? So now, what is the role of and for lack of a better, what's the role of an educated black person at that time? What's the role of a black leader at that time? Right? So have you all ever heard of a man named Richard Allen?
Yes.
Who's Richard Allen?
Richard Allen.
Richard Allen. Well, there's two gentlemen named Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Right? So they responded to Matthew Carey in 1793. They wrote a letter challenging what Matthew Carey said. And they laid out all the things that black people had did during the yellow fever epidemic to help the city, to really rebuild, help the city get through this epidemic. And of course they said we weren't stealing anything, right? They laid it out, put it all in papers, went to the legislature, did the whole big thing. It was very important because it helped beat back this stigma, as the young lady said, of how what was being created about black people in Philadelphia. Now I start with that for a particular reason because Richard Allen becomes a very important person in our thing. He becomes important when we get to this 1830, another date that becomes very important. But in between that, there are two other dates that become very important in this story I'm trying to tell, right? So Richard Allen, 1793. And Richard Allen and Absalom Jones are also important because they were the founders of the first African Methodist Episcopal Church in this country, right? AME Zion. Right? In Philadelphia, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, right? Which is again, when we look at how to solve problems, black people were not allowed to pray or to be in the church in the same way as white folk. So black people were relegated to the bleachers. So black folk came in down one time, they said, no, we want to pray on the ground floor just like everybody else, and they were kicked out the church. They were not allowed to do it. So they said, we need to go start our own church, right? So you had the birth of black churches, right? 1813, Philadelphia again. And I'm not saying this just because I'm born in Philadelphia, but this is the history, right? There's a man named James Forten, right? Now here's Philadelphia again. Is Philadelphia, what state is Philadelphia in?
Here.
Is Pennsylvania a slave state?
No.
No, right? But Pennsylvania, in 1813, the white people are upset about all these free black people that are coming to Pennsylvania, particularly Philadelphia. So white folk at that time are pushing the legislature to do something about it. So the Pennsylvania legislature were devising a bill that was going to restrict the number of black people who could come into Pennsylvania, particularly Philadelphia, right? They wanted to restrict it, right? Remember, this is a bill. We're dealing with public policy, right? So James Forten, who was a wealthy black man, shipbuilder, friend of Richard Allen, friend of Paul Cuffman, we'll talk about Cuffman in a minute, right? James Forten writes, and you can write this term down, this is what it was called, letters from a black man in Philadelphia, right? He wrote a series of letters challenging the Pennsylvania legislature's bill, proposed legislation, right? Now this is remarkable for 1813. We all have to understand that. Think about it. What kind of political representation do black people have in the Pennsylvania legislature or in Philadelphia legislature in 1813? What kind would you imagine? Yeah, they don't, right? What kind of voting electoral power do black people have, right? So for him to be able to write this and publish it, and not only that, guess what? The bill didn't get passed. They succeeded, right? So these series of letters, which were written in 1813, they get republished in 1828 in the first black newspaper in this country, Freedom's Journal. We'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so that's another important moment where somebody saw a problem and said, I have to do something, or we have to do something to address this problem. And writing to the legislator and challenging the proposed legislation was an important step, right?
What was the proposed legislation?
The proposed legislation was to limit the number of black people coming into the state. So it wanted to really put a hold on how many black migrants were migrating into Pennsylvania, right? Because you gotta understand too, one can imagine that a good number of the people who were coming into to Pennsylvania, particularly Philadelphia, were runaways, right? People who had got out of Dodge, right? Now Pennsylvania had been a state that was welcoming to runaways, right? Matter of fact, the fugitive slave law in the United States Constitution, Pennsylvania had drafted their own law stating that they didn't have to help anyone capture any runaway slaves, and they would not. Matter of fact, that they would arrest anyone who came from another state to capture a runaway slave. That went to the Supreme Court in 1836. There was a case called Prigg versus Pennsylvania, right? A black woman named Mary, her name wasn't Prigg. Edward Prigg is the slave catcher. A black woman who was brought from slavery in Maryland with her master to Pennsylvania. She lived as a free woman in Pennsylvania. Her master died. And remember, Pennsylvania had passed a law that no one could come and capture a runaway with the intention of taking them back into slavery, right? Even though there's a fugitive slave law in the United States Constitution. So the young lady, I'm blanking on her name, when her master died, well, her supporters, the abolitionists, they were like, well, she's free. His children said no. They wanted her to get her back. So they hired a slave catcher, Edward Prigg. Edward Prigg came to get her back, and Edward Prigg was arrested in Pennsylvania. And then the slave owners and all them, they paid for his defense and all that kind of stuff, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. They said they're violating the law, right? They cannot arrest them. So the Supreme Court is a big case, Prigg v. Pennsylvania, and I think the case came down actually 1842. In that case, in 1842, the Supreme Court said Pennsylvania and other states cannot stop people coming from the capture their runaway slaves. But they are under no obligation to help them. Right? So both sides didn't like the decision. The slave catchers didn't like it. Slave catchers didn't like it because, right, so think about it. If I'm wanted in New Jersey and I go over, let's say, into Georgia somewhere, and authorities from New Jersey go to Georgia to try to find me, and the people in Georgia say, well, we ain't gonna help you. What's the chance that they're gonna find me? They're not, right? So the slave catchers knew that. They knew that if states could say, we're not gonna help you find them, slave catchers, well, we ain't gonna find people, right? So they knew it was gonna make it hard, right? But at the same time, abolitionists, people who believed in freedom, the fact that the state could not arrest people for coming to capture runaways, they knew that was a problem too, right? So that was a serious decision, right? And that's another decision that will lead us to civil war, actually. But anyway, so Pennsylvania, 1813 we had, 1817, right? Now, here's where we're getting a connection, a direct connection to what we're going to talk about in terms of 1972. 1817. There's an organization formed called the American Colonization Society, right? American Colonization Society. 1817. Anybody ever heard of it? What is it? Now the teachers can say something if you want to do it. Yes.
It was an organization that searched for a new country for black people to live with free slaves.
You said search for a country for black people to go to?
Like in Africa, like Liberia, I think.
Was that a good thing?
No.
Why not?
They wanted black people out.
They wanted that, okay, right? So, American Colonization Society is formed in 1817, right? How do black people respond to it?
That's a loud well.
Black people, you know what they do? They have a convention. It's one of the first conventions that we have in our country for black people, 1817. And the convention was in direct response to this proposed American Colonization Society, right? So the convention comes, 1817, black people organized in Philadelphia, have a national convention in 1817. And out of that convention, black people said, we do not support the American Colonization Society. Yes.
Some black people actually did go to Africa and relocate.
Well, some did.
And
No
they
question.
do have programs like that still. They don't call it that, but you have programs like that.
Thank you for that.
But in Africa.
Thank you for that. So when I say that, there was a tension between some black people that wanted to go and other black people said, no, that's not going to be our policy. Now, why is that the tension there? The tension is there because the slave owners who some of them supported the American Colonization Society, the idea was if we can send black people to Africa or to somewhere else, then we can have a better run of it with the slave system. Because the free blacks were causing problems, right? So if we can get the free black people, and the free Negroes at the time, they said, if we can get them out, then the slave system can run better, right? So it wasn't a thing where we want to help you. It was a thing where it was a few things. It was one thing was this will strengthen the slave system. The other factor was, well, we cannot, and this goes back to Thomas Jefferson. What is Thomas Jefferson's famous writing, other than the Declaration of Independence? What's this other famous writing? It's very racist.
Something about Virginia.
Notes on the state of Virginia, right? In Notes in the State of Virginia,
I tremble.
Thomas Jefferson, say that again?
I tremble for my country when I think that God is just.
That's right. Thomas Jefferson was laying out scientifically why black people were inferior and why black people were unfit to really cohabitate with white people, right? So that kind of sentiment permeated throughout the country. And people were advocating, well, yeah, and you had people who were, I really don't agree with slavery, but I also don't think black people really can be civilized. So it's probably best that they go live somewhere else. right? So you had that sentiment with the ACS, right? But then you got black folk who said, well, I understand some of us want to go to Africa or Haiti or somewhere else. That's okay. But we should not support this venture because this isn't in our best interest, right? So that's where that tension came in at. And it's a tension that happens really all throughout the 19th century, where you have black leaders saying, well, this is our country, we built it, we're not going anywhere. And then you had other black people saying, well, you know what, it's best that we go somewhere else. That tension was always there. So in 1817, it happens also to be the year of the death of Paul Cuffey. Paul Cuffey was a leading black immigrationist, right? And he was trying to go to Sierra Leone. As a matter of fact, he did take people to Sierra Leone. I forget how many black people he took to Sierra Leone. But anyway, that's neither beyond the point. So, first major national convention, 1817, right? Now, the Black Convention movement starts 1830, right? It starts in 1830. So now the questions that I have for you is, in 1830, what issues are black people what problems are black people trying to solve? One is quite clear. What's the one that's quite clear? Slavery, right? What are the other issues that they're trying to solve? So this convention is called, again, in Philadelphia, 1830. Now remember Richard Allen. Richard Allen was the first president of the first national convention. And it was more an honorary thing because he's older right then, so they respected him and said, okay, Richard Allen is the president of this first national convention, 1830, right? So slavery, well, what else? Issue is, well, education. How are we going to be educated? How are we going to educate ourselves? What else? What other issues do you think black people were trying to grapple with? Yes. Political power, right? The right to vote, suffrage, and that's another theme that comes all throughout the 19th century. How are we going to get our rights, right? The other issue that we'll see coming up over and over again is, well, do we get our freedom by a term that becomes popular at that time, by moral suasion? And moral suasion was a term adopted by the Garrisonians, William Lloyd Garrison. They pushed moral suasion. Moral suasion meaning, well, let me ask you before I tell you what it means. What do you think that term means, moral suasion?
Moral persuasion. So trying to convince you something's wrong, right?
Correct, right? Was that you about to say? Yeah, correct, right? So are we going to do it that way? Or, if we don't do it that way, what's the other alternative? Violence, right? We're going to do it that way, right? Because you all have to know, by 1830, just in that decade, you had Denmark Vesey. Y'all heard of Denmark Vesey?
No.
Okay. Denmark Vesey was in Charleston, South Carolina. This is 1822, right? Denmark Vesey had a plan, and we're using Denmark Vesey's name, but it wasn't just him. And we always had to be cognizant of that. Sometimes when we teach history and talk about history, we have this great man theory, or great woman theory, this great leader came and all that, but it's always a group. It's always in a context. But at any rate, Denmark Vesey was one of the prominent leaders of this planned rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina. Right? Now it's interesting, one of the reasons black people were rebelling in Charleston, South Carolina, they had got wind of a new policy that was going to happen, that was going to impact black people even in a negative way. And so they decided, we got to rebel, right? So the rebellion failed, right? One of the coldest too, you ever heard of Peter Poyers? Peter Poyers was one of Denmark Vesey's comrades. One of the coldest things I ever heard. Peter Poyers, when they were caught, he tells Denmark Vesey and one of the other leaders, he says, do as you see me do and die quietly. That's what he told them. Do as you see me do and die quiet. Right? That's cold to me. Right? Imagine somebody about to kill you, you're about to die, and it's not even going to be, they're not putting you to death like in a nice way, if there's a nice way to die, in a calm way, in a peaceful way. They're not going to do that, right? Do you all know how they killed black people at that time? Not just lynch. They skin them alive. They set them on fire. The men, they cut their genitals off. They beat them. They torture them. They do all those kind of things. Now, your body shuts down after a certain, so I'm sure people's bodies shut down after, imagine getting skinned alive, right? Imagine that. Set on fire, all that kind of stuff, then shot, all kinds of crazy stuff. So Peter Poyer is like, just do as you see me do. Die quiet, right? Don't even give him, what that means is don't give him the satisfaction. Don't give him the satisfaction, right? Of screaming and running and all that. That's a real gangster thing.
That sounds easier than said than done.
People did it though.
Skinned alive.
Some people did it though.
Yeah, but if you get skinned alive, like how you gonna keep that skin?
You ain't never been that mad. That's what I'm saying. You ain't never been that upset. He was that upset at something, it happened. Not saying I know nothing about it, but if you get that upset, you ever seen a fight in school where somebody really got on somebody's nerves, and you know the suspension coming, you know that the principal coming, you know it's all gonna go bad, and the person be like, I'm good. Imagine like somebody sold your kid in front of you.
And the thing is too,
Yeah.
and I may be wrong, and you all can correct me if I'm wrong, but in my understanding about pain in mind is a mental thing. I might be wrong, but pain is a mental thing that we expect something. It's like a child is about to get whooped, and they start screaming and crying already. You ain't even touch them, right? But they already in pain because you're, look at, right? But you haven't even touched them yet. What you doing, right? You haven't even touched them yet, right? And then you hit them and they just, oh God, oh, right? But there's nothing wrong, right? And then there's other times when people really do get hurt, don't even know it, and then somebody say, man, you're bleeding. Then you look and they see they got their skin to the white meat, they be like, oh my God, right? But they didn't even know it.
No, they just don't know it.
Yeah, they don't know it. So from what I understand, it's a mental thing. And that is very popular. Matter of fact, you can see there were Buddhists who would set themselves on fire. And they just be sitting there on fire. They're not screaming, they're not doing nothing. They just sitting there chilling. They're not chilling, but they're on fire, right? They don't scream.
Right.
So that's the point. So if you look at that, that's a perfect example. You see how you fall right into a perfect example? If the Buddhists could do it, right?
I mean, they gotta train themselves.
Well, hey, he was just giving an example, right? If you imagine being enslaved, imagine fighting for your freedom, hating the institution of slavery, and ready to do whatever, you're ready to die for it, you get caught, imagine that you're like, well, whatever, I'm ready.
It's cool.
It's
I
cool,
fought for this, but
right? And that's where the gospel, the spiritual, I'd rather be dead in my grave than to live as a slave, right? But anyway, okay.
Also, didn't he was at that was where the Mother Emanuel Church, he planned that at the church, the Mother Emanuel Church, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's why Dylan Roof thought it was gonna be a rebellion if you kill people.
Yeah, that's right. So that was happening. So black people, when they come to 1830, you got the Denmark Vesey thing that happened. Another person who was a part of that, and I don't want to go too far afield, forgive me if I'm doing, but these stories are important.
They are.
I'm enjoying it.
Yeah.
1822, another person who was a part of that planning but who got away is a man named David Walker.
I didn't know David Walker was a part
David
of
Walker
that.
was in South Carolina.
Oh,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, David Walker was in there. David Walker's a free black man, so he gets out of South Carolina, goes to Boston, and he writes an appeal to the colored citizens of the world.
I didn't know that.
This is
was
18
in the rebellion with Denmark Vesey and got away?
He was a part of the planning. Denmark, he was there to support. He was free. There's a lot of free blacks who helped, but he got away. Before, there's a lot of people that got away. He wasn't the only one that got away. What? Right?
So write the, what, you're looking at.
An appeal to the colored citizens of the world.
1829.
1829. And in that appeal, there's another cold thing to say. This is a gangster. I'm telling you, man.
He told God.
This is some gangster stuff. When we think about gangsters, I mean, like real, and gangsters not, I don't want to put it, it's not necessarily a pejorative word, but to do something that's gangster, David Walker tells in an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, he tells, and this is written to, wants to get to people who are still enslaved. He says, it is no more harm for you to kill your master than it is to take a drink of water when thirsty. That's cold. Think about that. As easy as it is for you to get a drink of water, that's how easy it should be for you to kill your master. Right? That's right. So David Walker, he published that in 1829. That was getting all out, and it did get to people who are enslaved, right? It did get to them, right? David Walker, of course, died. We don't know how he died. We don't know what happened to him. He probably got killed. Some people argue. I see historians say he didn't. He probably was sick and died. Other people say, you know, I use my natural black common sense. I ain't even worry about that. Somebody killed him, right? Sometimes we can get too academic. Somebody killed him, right? If he's talking about produces a revolutionary track, then all of a sudden end up dead. Somebody killed him, right? So but anyway. So that was 1829, right? So black people, when they come in 1830, you're thinking about David Walker. You're thinking about them monkeys. So these debates are happening. Well, should we rebel? So 1830, they weren't ready to do it. But then we get to 1843, and there's one of the more famous black conventions in Rochester, New York, right? And at this convention, there's a man named Henry Highland Garnett. Right? Here's another interesting thing about this stuff. A lot of the leaders who came out at that time, in 1843, Henry Highland Garnett, there's another man named James McCune Smith. He was the first black physician in this country's history. He wrote the introduction to My Bondage, My Freedom, Frederick Douglass' second autobiography. Frederick Douglass said he was the most brilliant man in the 19th century. James McCune Smith, Henry Highland Garnett, Alexander Carmel, who was a mentor to W.E.B. Du Bois, right? All these, not Henry Mill Turner, I'm coming to a story, not yet. But all these people, you know what? They all went to the same school. The African Free School in New York. They all came out of this school, right? You got to see what they were doing. They were all mentored by another reverend named Peter Williams Jr. People I've never heard of these people, right? Another reverend, Samuel Cornish, Theodore Wright. Samuel Cornish was one of the founders of the first Freedom's Journal. He's the first editor, first black newspaper in this country's history. They were mentoring these young people, right? Brilliant people. So Henry Highland Garnett, who came out of there, Henry Highland Garnett was mentored by a man named Theodore Wright. He was also a reverend who was a good friend and colleague by Samuel Cornish. He was mentored by Samuel Cornish. Henry Highland Garnett, in this thing here, 1843, he comes to the convention and they're debating. And this is the whole point of this whole thing. They're sitting debating, right? So debating is a part of our tradition in trying to solve these problems, right? Henry Highland Garnett, he said, okay, let our motto be resistance. That's the title of his famous speech. Let our motto be resistance. So his thing is not moral suasion. It's time to get the guns out, and that's the only way we're going to end it, right? When people tell a story about that convention, it was a fierce debate, and his proposed legislation fell one vote short, right? So the convention was split. Right? Now, one of the people who helped move it to sway the other way was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was like, no.
Oh, he the one with the school thing.
Frederick Douglass was like, no, Frederick Douglass was like, it's suicide, right? Now, you all got to understand, we have to unpack it, right? Could black people have won a physical rebellion?
Yes.
Y'all think they could have?
Yeah.
I don't know.
They not as soft as us.
I don't know.
Actually, depending on the
We can't
area.
even stop watching the NFL. They would.
It depends on the area.
Huh?
New York, yes.
It depends. That's an excellent, what you just said is an excellent observation. Because one always has to consider what part of this country you're in, what region you're in.
You want to do something.
Well, but see, it depends
If it
on
works
the
in
terrain.
the-
Because at that time, there were certain places in the country where you could afford a guerrilla war.
Yeah, but I don't know, I just feel like the deep south is just not, it's too many things.
But I think you might have a better chance in the deep south than in the urban.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
won.
because there's more.
We won a whole bunch of times in the Deep South, just for the record. The Stone Age Rebellion, the Maroons.
That's true, but I just feel like they're too.
It's too hot.
And others had
No,
most
they're
of
too willing to
the
use
slaves,
slaves,
but
they don't really care about your children. I feel like
And let's remember too, so, by the time we get to 1859 and Harper's Ferry and John Brown, Frederick Douglass told him it was suicide. Right? Y'all know why they went to Harper's Ferry? What's at Harper's Ferry? Y'all know John Brown.
Yeah.
Y'all remember Harper's Ferry? No? History class?
Critical race theory.
We
Y'all
are
don't
from American history. They don't care.
You're gonna have to tell me who John Brown is.
Oh, wow.
I'm glad that they knew who Ray Brown was. At the
All
time.
roads.
Okay, so let me back up and tell it this way. John Brown, there's a great book called by John Stauffer called The Black Hearts of Men. And it's a story about 4 individuals. James McCune Smith, who I mentioned, Frederick Douglass, those are the 2 brothers, and 2 white people, John Brown and Garrett Smith. Garrett Smith is a rich white man who believes that black people are just like white people, right? He doesn't believe, he's one of those white people in the 19th century who is not racist, right? In his heart and his mind, he's not racist, right? So he's building with these. Matter of fact, Garrett Smith gave land to black people in New York, upstate New York. He bought all this land, he said, hey, this is for black people, right? Matter of fact, Garrett Smith was the one, James McCune Smith, he said, you run it, you direct, Now, it failed for a variety of reasons, but it was a colony that he created, tried to create for black folk, right? So he was very supportive, right? Garrett Smith was John Brown now. John Brown also was somebody who wasn't racist. And John Brown was friends with Frederick Douglass and all that, went to his home, visited his home and all that kind of stuff. John Brown and his family, he raised his children not to be racist, but also they were committed to ending slavery by any means necessary. John Brown is somebody who believed, I will kill you if I have to, right? And he did that, right? Have you all ever heard of Bleeding Kansas? Bleeding Kansas was, so you all know that all throughout the 19th century, the issue of slavery is the issue, right? Kansas was one of those states where they left it up to the people to decide whether they were going to be a slave or free state. So when they did that, the people came to blows. It was a revolution in Kansas, right? John Brown was a veteran of that, right? He went through, chopping people's hands off. Not literally, but darn near, right? That was 1856. So John Brown, by 1859, he tells Frederick Douglass, it's time. I got a plan. We're going to raid Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry is where the ammunition depot was. Harper's Ferry, we're going to raid it. We're going to go up in there. We're going to get them guns and all that, and we're going to kick this thing off. Are you with me? Frederick Douglass said, no, right? But I will get some people. If other people want to do it with you, I'm not going to stop you, right? I don't think you can win, right? I don't think you can win. Frederick Douglass did recruit some people to help John Brown out, right? Garrett Smith, the other white man, he was one of the, John Brown had a secret 6. A secret 6. These were white anti-slavery people who funded him and gave him money and all that. Garrett Smith was one of them, right? Matter of fact, The Battle Hymn of the Republic was written by the wife of Julia Ward Howe, the wife of another one of the secret 6. That's The Battle Hymn of the Republic. This stuff is interesting history, y'all. I'm telling you, I'm sorry if I'm going too far afield.
No, it's good.
No, you're good.
This stuff is this stuff trips me out. It really does. Because when we see the first Memorial Day celebration, right? You know where that was? Charleston, South Carolina. You know who was there? The son of Denmark Vesey. You know what they were singing? John Brown's Body. Follow me now. Black people in Charleston, South Carolina, after the Civil War, they want to honor the dead. Not just the black dead, to honor the dead, the Union soldiers, right? They're marching to the song John Brown's Body. John Brown, the revolutionary who had led the raid on Harper's Ferry, who had died for black people, right? John Brown died, a couple of his sons died, some black people died. Shields Green was probably the most famous black person that died. They all died in that raid, right? So they marching to it. They sing John Brown's Body. Julia Ward Howe takes that song and remixes it, and it becomes the battle hymn of the Republic, right? So for me, when people talk about the national anthem like that, I prefer the battle hymn of the Republic. I can get down with the battle hymn of the Republic because of what it stood for, right? Remember, her husband was one of the Secret Six, right? So that's very interesting. So Memorial Day started with that celebration in Charleston, South Carolina. That's where Memorial Day comes from. That's the roots of Memorial Day, right? But at any rate, 1843, going back, convention, right? Henry Highland Garnett, his whole idea of revolution failed. Last one in the 19th century I'll talk about. So in 1850, you have something called, that was passed, the Fugitive Slave Act, right? Again, when people see problems, you have to see, well, how do we solve these problems? The Fugitive Slave Act was a significant blow to lovers of freedom. Because in that Fugitive Slave Act, they gave more leeway for slaveholders to get to capture runaways, right? So when that was passed, black people said we got to do something. We need another convention. So in 1853, they have the last major convention, I believe, before the Civil War, right? And in this convention, and Frederick Douglass helped write it out, you know, the black agenda that came from that was really amazing. I think I have it. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah. Let me see if I can. But it was 1853, and what they said out of that convention was very important. I might not be able to find it fast enough. Do me a favor, please. Right? But in that 1853 convention, they laid out. Okay, thank you. So the 1853 convention adopted the address of the Colored Convention to the People of the United States, drawn up by Frederick Douglass. This remarkable address set forth the basic demands of the Negro people for justice and equality. The address demanded that the doors of the schoolhouse, the workshop, the church, the college shall be thrown open as freely to all children as the children of other members of the community. Now pause right there. Do you all know that's the whole thing? That's the civil rights movement. What they just said right there, that's the civil rights movement. This is 1853, right? All right, let's keep going. That the white and black may stand upon an equal footing before the laws of the land. That colored men shall not be either by custom or enactment be excluded from the jury box. That the complete and unrestricted right of suffrage, right to vote, which is essential to the dignity even of the white man, be extended to the free colored man. Now, clearly, it's gender. So one of the problems we were seeing was they ain't talking about black women. They ain't talking about women, period. They said the white man got the right to vote, black man should have the right to vote, right? It's limited, but it's important. And that laws flagrantly unjust to the man of color ought to be repealed. These demands were justified on the simple principle that the Negro people were American citizens asserting their rights on their own native soil, right? That's 1853, right? So that was black people's demand. That was what they came out of that convention demanding, right? And of course, everything got torn asunder when we get the Dred Scott decision a few years later. Y'all heard of Dred Scott, right? What was the Dred Scott decision? Why was that important? What did that decision say? See, these things are important because we have to think about history is important. When we're seeing what people are doing and trying to solve these problems, we have to understand the problems that they were looking at and what kind of solutions that they were trying to grapple with. Because now when we look at it from today's lens and the problems that we're trying to solve, we're not doing it out of thin air. We're going back and saying, well, what did people do before? How did they address these issues before, right? So the Dred Scott decision, the thing in that decision that was so problematic for people, it said no black person has any rights that a white person is bound to respect at any time, right? So now you got free black people, and hold on, because you had free black people who weren't down for the cause.
No.
You had free black people like, I'm cool, right? We do need to be a little bit more civilized, right? But when that decision came down, free black people were like, well, me too? Me? It's me, right? They like, no, you too, right? Then that's when they be like, oh man, no. I'm going to Canada, right? So you can go to Canada. Then other people are like, well, maybe let's go abroad, let's go somewhere else. Martin Delaney, Henry Highland, all that say, we need to get out of this country, right? Or you got the people who were with John Brown, we need to fight, right? So all those things came together with the Civil War, right? All right, so now, fast forward. Right before we get to
before we get into that,
yes.
just for clarity, the Dred Scott decision, seems to be the decision that pushed everything over.
It did.
In other words, if you were black and free, you were like, oh, I'm either leaving or fighting, right?
Right.
And if you it seems like there's either going to be civil war or we got.
That's right.
Because there's no way that this is working right now. So there's no peaceful settlement of this. It's only violence.
It's only violence. And that's what John Brown conclusion he came to. That's why he did what he did. And you had other black people saying we have the same thing. Frederick Douglass still was still not ready to get to that point. He still wasn't ready to get to that point.
But is that because Frederick Douglass believed that war should be fought? He believed in the North fighting the South? What was Frederick Douglass still believed in a peaceful solution? How did that?
I think Frederick Douglass wanted to still find a peaceful solution to the problem. I think Frederick Douglass believed in personal self-defense, but I don't think he thought that we could win in just a physical revolution. All right, so we fast forward, so we know all the history. I can't go through the whole 20th century because we're running out of time. I spent too much time on that, I think.
No, it's good. I mean, take time. We'll give you some more time for this because this is actually really important stuff.
Thank you.
Do what you need to do.
So in the 20th century, we get the civil rights movement, which didn't just start with Rosa Parks, it started before that, right? So we won't go through that whole history. But by the time we get to the 1960s, in 1964, in 1965, in 1966, in 1967, and in 1968, you had rebellions in this country every year. First one in 1964 was in Rochester, New York, and you had one in Philadelphia. 1965, you had Watts, which was a very big one. What did you have in 1967? What was the rebellion in 1967? The Newark, right? And you had another one in Detroit in 1967, right? So in response to these things that are happening, you get a couple different things. The government is trying to figure out, well, how do we respond to it? And there was a Kerner Commission report that came out in 1967, something called the Kerner Commission. It was a report to study the rebellions. They called it riots. We can talk about the difference between the rebellion and the riot. But they talked about it. But black people started coming together and started having conferences. A. Philip Randolph called the first one. Adam Clayton Powell. Adam Clayton Powell called the first one in 1966, right? So now you start having a series of what they call these Black Power conferences. Amiri Baraka helped organize one in 1967 in Newark, on the heels of the Newark Rebellion, right? And you had a lot of black leaders descend on Newark in 1967. Maulana Karenga, the founder of Kwanzaa, he was here. Dick Gregory was here. Dick Gregory was a leading black comedian, but also activist, right? But Amiri Baraka was one of the leaders of that, you know. So they're debating, well, how do we solve these problems? One of the things that came out of that was to protest the 1968 Olympics. The idea came out of that, those conferences that they were doing. They said, well, one of the things we can do is protest the Olympics. And you get in 1968, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, Black Power, right, at the 1968 Olympics. You get that, right? But what happened there, after Dr. King is assassinated, his wife starts this King Foundation. His wife attends a conference in Atlanta, another Black Power conference, where Amiri Baraka and things, and his wife and them agree that one of the things that we should do is see how we can take over in terms of electoral power at the local level. And Baraka and them said, well, we've been having some conferences, let's have another major conference, and let's discuss these issues, right? So what happens is 1972, because now you got to understand, in 1967 and 68, you start getting black mayors elected, right? You had one elected in Gary, Indiana, Richard Hatcher. Richard Hatcher threw open his doors to the black community, right? He said, come to Gary, Indiana, and let's have our conference. So black leaders, black elected officials, black religious leaders, black grassroots activists, black union leaders from all over came to Gary, Indiana. There was over 10,000 people there, I believe. Came to Gary, Indiana in 1972. The theme of it was unity without uniformity. Anybody know, what does that mean when you hear that? When you hear the phrase unity without uniformity, what does that mean to you? What do you think that means?
Unity without what?
Uniformity. Say it again. Right, exactly. We can all be unified in trying to address these problems, but we don't have to do it the same way, right? Sounds great, right? So they came together and they had people serve as delegates from all these different states, right? Illinois, Pennsylvania, New York. Matter of fact, you said Larry Ham was here yesterday?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right? He talked about that?
He did not. No, he did not.
So Larry Ham, who was here yesterday, he was the youngest delegate. I want to say he was the youngest delegate at the convention period, but I know he was the youngest delegate from New Jersey, right? Larry Ham had been mentored by Amiri Baraka. So Larry Ham went as a young delegate. That experience helped energize him to get involved and do what he does now, right? So at that Gary convention, they're debating, well, what are we going to do about the prison industry? What are we going to do about education? What are we going to do about this issue of busing? What are we going to do about, are we going to stay in the Democratic and Republican Party? What are we going to do about that? What are we going to do about economic development for black people? What are we going to do about our relationships to the African diaspora? What are we going to do about our allies? How do we look at Palestine? Are y'all with me? Right? So these are all issues that they had. And the thing about it is, and this is what's unfortunate, we got the same issues today. The same problems they were looking at, by and large, are still the problems that we have to look at today, right?
The convention almost came apart like 3 times, right?
The convention almost came apart 3 times. It's very hard. When you put a group of black leaders in a room, it's very hard to sometimes to come to figure out a common ground, right? Because it's a lot of people are very intelligent, and when you have a lot of intelligent people in there, it's hard to tell an intelligent person that they might be wrong, and it's hard to get into. Am I making sense?
How true is it that Coleman, that I heard a story where Mary Baraka was said to have come, the Michigan delegation was going to walk out.
Yes.
And then he comes to the mic and just, in his own way.
Mary Baraka did. He
Stop
helped
saying the
keep
word.
them in.
Just
Half
say
of
the
the
word.
delegation did walk out.
Yeah.
Ron Daniels,
Yeah.
who
Young.
instituted the Black World.
Yeah.
Ron Daniels Ron Daniels was part of that delegation, and you hear Ron Daniels on the video saying, "Mr. Chairman, it's not true that the Michigan delegation walked out. Only a part of the Michigan delegation had walked out. We are still here. We're still working with you. We're still, So a part of the Michigan delegation did walk out, primarily because Coleman Young and Michigan is a very big, had a lot of union interests. So they felt like some of the things being advocated would not benefit the union. And you all have to understand too. And this is the problem. There's a lot of complexity and nuance we have to get when we look at problems. So a problem isn't just a problem. You have to unpack it. So if we look at an issue, let's say we look at Palestine and Israel, right? Let's say we look at that issue. It's not as simple as saying, well, A is wrong or B is wrong. We have to look at the interests. Where do unions get their money? Where do labor unions get their money? They get it from the members. Do they get it anywhere else? Well, let me not say it that way. Who are important allies for labor unions? A labor union. Who's an important ally? Who do labor unions need in order to get, say again? Yeah, but who else? Who do labor unions need if they want to get things done? If they want their interests protected? Politicians. Politicians. Coleman Young and other labor union leaders, they like, okay, if I'm a labor union leader and there's something passed at Gary Convention to support the Palestinians in their struggle against Israel, if I'm Coleman Young, I'm sitting there looking at this like, if I do this, there might be some politicians not happy with it. Why would the politicians not be happy with it? Because those politicians are supported by who? Or concerned about what? Israel. Right? So, are y'all following me? So Coleman Young is already thinking, well, if I come out and support the Palestinians, I'm going to have to think, I got to think about this support I'm getting from these politicians that I need. Those politicians get support or cannot come out against Palestine. And you have a lot of politicians that I'm out. Y'all want to deal with the Palestine issue, I'm out. That was a hot button, that was a third rail issue, right? Because of the interest that politicians had. Politicians weren't willing to walk out. Many of them weren't willing to walk out and say, we support the Palestinians, because they knew what kind of problem that would bring for them. Activists and all that kind of stuff, yeah, we with the Palestinians, so they don't have to worry about it. They got the political fallout, right? So those kind of things came up and became particular problems for the convention, which is why we get a black agenda. And the biggest thing about the black agenda that came out was that people went back to the states they were in and worked in those states and trying to get things done, right? So, you about to say something?
No.
So the key thing that you all have to think about, you look at these particular issues, we look at the policy implications of the issues, but you also look at the historical context of these issues. And there's a question in politics that we always ask. The most fundamental question is, who benefits? That's the most fundamental question. Any problem we look at, we say, well, who benefits? Who benefits from it? Right? Somebody, matter of fact, give me a problem right now. Right now in America, right now, what's today? August 23rd, 2022. What's a major problem right now in the United States? Huh? Well, narrow it down. Abortion rights. Right? Abortion. Who benefits from, okay, what did the Supreme Court just decide on abortion?
Bennett. I mean, the state rights of
All right, so who benefits from that? Who benefits? Think about it.
Conservatives.
Okay, why? How do they benefit?
Well, there's no longer a federal restriction on the ability to ban, so they are allowed like heartbeat bills and stuff like that. And probably white people for whatever generational reasons.
Yes.
But conservatives also, like, conservatives also push their agenda towards
So it just doesn't stop with the abortion issue. It has other.
There are a lot of testing damages on top of the
That's true. So see, all what you all said is true, and that's what when we're debating and trying to understand the issue, we have to unpack it, and we have to ask that fundamental question: well, who benefits from this, right? And then the question becomes: okay, now that it's passed, then how can we address it? If you are against that legislation, and that's another thing, that's the challenge too. If we all are a part of a convention, and we all are trying to solve problems, one of the fundamental things you have to be willing to do is, if the group votes on something, you got to be willing to go along with it. So how many of us are in here? 5, 8, 9, 10, 15, 17 people. So if we all said we're against abortion, but 2 of you all believe, no, I can't do it. I'm firmly for it, right? But we're part of a committee. We are unity without uniformity. We're trying to get it done. So what do the 2 do when we say, well, we're going to recommend that black people do X, Y, Z to oppose what the Supreme Court did, right? Whatever that X, Y, Z is. What do the 2 people who believe in what the Supreme Court do, what are they to do now? Yeah, once you are a part of something, once you've debated it, once you've discussed it, and it didn't go your way, you got to go along with it, right? Because otherwise, nothing gets done, right? If everybody took their ball and went home every time they didn't get everything they want, then it's not going to work, right? Politics is the art of compromise. That's what politics is. You got to compromise. You can't get everything you want, right? And what happened at the Gary Convention, there were people who walked out and gave up on it because they couldn't get everything they wanted. And you have to understand, when you have politicians that are a part of a convention, and then you have black nationalists that are a part of the convention, then you might have black conservatives that are a part of it. Well, many there, but you have some black conservatives. Then you have the black religious, and even in the religious context, the people in black religion didn't know, black churches all didn't see the issue the same way. Clay was there. Reverend Leon Sullivan was there. So you had all these people there, strong personalities, different interests. How do you get it? And that's a challenge. So when we look at the model Gary Convention, what we're trying to do with it, what we're challenging young people to do is, we're challenging you to solve these problems. Not only the problems of abortion and racism and all these kind of things, but we're challenging you to solve the problems of black leaders coming together and not being able to stay together. Does that make sense? We can't repeat same problems of the past, right? How do we come together with different ideas? How do we debate the issues? How do we come up with policy recommendations without falling out with each other? How do we do it? Questions? Yes.
Well, let them ask questions first.
Y'all have any questions? Yes. Jonathan Austin has committed to being, Jonathan Austin was a part of it last year. And from what I understand, you all will be doing it this year. So what happened is this. Last year, I should say last school year, we had, it wound up being about 65 students participating from different schools in New Jersey. Each school, so we had, I think, 7 different topic areas. In each topic area, there's an issue. So each school would have at least 7 students representing the school. So that's a delegation. You can have more than 1 delegation per school. So the delegates, your responsibility is, if you're on the education committee, you're focusing on that issue. And you're trying to figure out, well, how do we address it? Your team comes together, your delegation comes together and discusses the issue, but there's 1 representative, right? Then there's a representative on the politics issue, right? Every different, economics and all that kind of stuff, health. So you debate it. You all come up with a policy recommendation, right? So you have a white paper. So you say, this is what our delegation believes should happen, right? Each delegation does that. Those policy recommendations are supposed to be shared with the other delegations. So you're doing this throughout the school year. So in March, was it March? April. At the end of April, we come together in a convention. So all the schools came together, and you sit at a table with other members from the education committee from the other schools. The other delegate sits at their table with the politics, So you all now debate, and debate's not doesn't have to be antagonistic, right? So you all sit at the table and debate these issues, right? Then from that, then you're going to come up with you're going to adjust what you believe, and you're going to write another recommendation that we will all vote on. And that would become our agenda. So what you're voting on is, how do we solve these problems? And that's what happened. And the students got real energized from it, and we could talk about that. But that's the process.
It's literally going through the process of what we do in the problem-solving process of policy debate, as in, here is a problem, here are different plans for solutions, here are some of those pros and cons, and and at the end, come up with, is that solution feasible, and they vote on it, and then the whole convention votes on it. So I mean, it's a cool process. It's kind of like Congress, except for dealing with problems that Black people would have all over the country in all these different issues.
Black and brown.
Yeah, true. Because it was a multiracial convention. A question? Does anyone else have a question right now?
I do.
Okay.
What are your views on that
I love it. That's an interesting question. You mean, like, do I support it?
Well, not exactly, but like, I feel like it kind of had more of a negative impact because it led to being banned from reading and writing as a actor.
It led to what being banned?
Reading and
Oh.
writing. So,
Yeah, well,
do you think it had any positive?
so one of the interesting things that we should do sometimes is go back and look at what Black people in the 19th century thought about it. Black people in the 19th century loved that term. They respected him because they understood what it was he was trying to do. So I think and if we think about how brutal the system of slavery was, because I think even as much as we use our imagination today, it really is it's impossible for us to really feel what people were feeling. But just imagine having seen your daughter being taken into the master's house to be raped. Just imagine. Imagine a black man seeing his wife being stripped away from him and being raped and beaten. Imagine a wife seeing her husband or her child being beaten and there's nothing she can do about it. Imagine them seeing someone being beaten to death and there's nothing you can do about it. Imagine that. Imagine seeing someone who tried to escape and got caught and fought their master and got killed because of it, and they cut their heads off and they put it on a pike for people to see as a reminder. Imagine walking into a plantation and seeing black heads greet you, right? They were called blackhead signposts, right? Imagine that. So
there was a term, blackhead signpost.
Blackhead signposts.
There's a place called Negro Foot, Virginia.
What?
Now y'all know I don't tell no lies. Negro Foot, Virginia. If you Google it, maybe I lied. They're like, what? Yeah.
So I say all that to say, when you have all that, you have a nat term. You have people that say, I can't, I would rather die
Read it out loud,
than deal with this, right? So that's what, so I understand that term.
No, I understand it, like, I'm not against it. I just
Yeah.
think the whole thing is getting goals and it adds.
Well, there's risk. Anytime you do anything, there's risk, right? And I think he understood the risk. And so the ban on reading and all that kind of stuff, it was there anyway. They didn't
I
want
thought
black.
it led to that because of Nat Turner's education. They thought that was the reason that.
Well, no. Well, so most black people, particularly who were enslaved, did not have access to education before that time, right? Most didn't, and you had to get it surreptitiously. You had to sneak to get it, or oftentimes it was the master's child, reading along with the other children and stuff like that. A lot of the children could read before the adults, right? So literacy was not ever something intended to be widespread for black people, before or after that time. Now it did change laws in terms of freedom of movement for people, right? But I mean, those things happened. When the Haitian Revolution happened, white slaveholders were on alert. They were scared to death. When the Haitian Revolution happened, they were like, we don't want anybody else from that island, right? Island of San Domingo, no more people from there. No thank you, right? And if you had somebody from there, you'd be like, well, send him away somewhere, right? Because we don't want them, right? So, of course, the drum was banging at a certain point because they found out people were communicating with the drum, right? So these kind of things would always happen. Yes.
Oh, is it true that in the Haitian Revolution they didn't want like other slaves knowing about it for them to do the same thing?
Other slaves in this country?
Yeah, like other slaves around the world knowing about it.
Definitely. Because it gives people ideas.
They also do that too because
They did what?
they do that too because when the British Revolution started, so they started doing that.
Yeah, well, they never wanted black people practicing their own form of spirituality. Yeah. But this is where the black genius comes in it, because they didn't understand how we took the Bible and used it and remixed it to fit, our purpose. So, yeah. What else? Other questions or concerns? Yes.
I was listening to you. When we think about this notion of unity without uniformity, how does that break down along like class lines? Is there a real is there real tension in 1972 the same way that there might be now in terms of the middle class and upper class people versus what working class black concerns were?
That's an excellent question. I think one of the criticisms that we can have, or critiques that we can have of the convention, that it wasn't necessarily that it privileged the middle and upper class.
So it's more like the Bandung Writers Conference than it is than the,
Right. So it's not. So even the one we have now in Newark, I think that we have the anniversary one. I think that we have to be very careful. It should always try to come from the ground up. And I think a lot of times when we did, even if we go back and look at the 19th century, the 19th century is more understandable because, it's free people. You can't have somebody who was enslaved can't leave a plantation and say, I'm going to a convention, right? I'll be back. Couldn't do it. But I think one of the things that we have to learn from it, but let me pause on my criticism of 72. Because the 72, what they did right was that they did a lot of grassroots efforts in their state before they got together, right? I'm not sure that the same thing is happening now. So when we look at the problems and when we try to have these conventions and stuff, one of the things that we should do is that there's a lot of work on finding out, on getting ideas and talking to people on the ground. And when I say on the ground, I don't mean just organizers. I mean average, everyday black folk. And we don't do the door-to-door stuff. So I think that one of the things that we should take from the civil rights movement was the SNCC organizers, what they did in Mississippi. They went door to door. They talked to people who were illiterate, all this kind of stuff. They talked to them about voting and all that kind of stuff. We don't do that anymore, right? So there's going to be a lot of people in Newark who have no idea about this anniversary convention because we're not going door to door. Am I making sense?
Right.
And that's the thing I think, Chris, I don't know if I'm answering your question yet, but that's the thing that we need to do. We need to learn. A lot of us don't know how to organize. And I should say that for our model Gary last year, the co-organizer was T.J. Whitaker, who's one of the founders of the Maplewood South Orange Freedom School, right? So I should say that it's not just my effort, but we just need to do a lot more grassroots organizing and really getting people engaged that way.
One thing I wanted you to explain sort of to the students is that a lot of times I've seen it when Elijah has given lectures about ontology and slavery and all of that. I think there's a real break between the ability to conceptualize what we're really talking about when you're talking about the condition of enslavement. I think it's like the 21st century lens, the reality of the world we live in, how we think about interactions with people, all of that, those sorts of things. I think and the anti-intellectual culture that the kids are growing up in now, even more than when I was in high school, it makes it difficult for people to fully conceptualize that. So if you could talk about that a bit, because I think a lot of things that get missed in these conversations is like the sheer captivity and brutality of what we're talking about. It's kind of hard to, one of the lines I think Elijah uses a bunch is like, in order to think about these things, that sit with pain and suffering, right? And a lot of times, I think it's hard for us to sort of really imagine that.
I think one of the things that we need to do more of is read slave narratives. I think that sometimes when we talk about stuff, one of the easiest things to do is go back and read the people who were living at that time. Because what happens is you get the stories and you get that pain that you're talking about. Because we don't do that a lot, right? I'll give you an example that's not related, why it's important to go back and read those folks. There's a hip hop artist named KRS-One. Have y'all heard, I know y'all know KRS-One. Have y'all heard of KRS-One?
No.
So KRS-One, very well, highly regarded, well respected hip hop artist. Nearly everyone, right? And have you ever heard that our original name was Negus? You ever heard me say that?
N-E-G-U-S.
N-E-G-U-S, Negus? So the argument was that the term nigger comes from niggas.
Yeah.
You believe it? Well, he argued that is about it, right?
Yeah, that's,
Okay. But there's a whole lot of people that believe that. There's people in the street that believe, yeah, niggas. I had somebody tell me that. Did you know? Oh, professor. You know how, professor. Did you know that our original name was niggas? I'm like, no, it wasn't. No, you wrong, professor, right? The thing I tell them to go back and do, I said, okay, show me a black person in the 19th century, go back and read their writings, go back and read the black newspapers, read their autobiography, read their narrative, read their poetry. Show me one black person that said, refer to black people as niggas. It's not there. It's not there. So, but KRS-One is saying that we've said this, we believe this, even though there's no evidence that any black person in the 19th century or before referred to themselves as niggas. Right? So, now that's a long answer, that's a convoluted answer. So when we're dealing with the pain and suffering, my point is, we don't have to just use our imagination. We can go back and look at what the people wrote. We can go back and look at the newspaper, and it's very important too. I shouldn't say just books. The black newspapers are very important. When you go back and look at what's being written in them, what people are talking about, the stories they're sharing, and all that kind of stuff, very important, right? So when you go back and look at it and hear the stories people are talking about differently, and you see it. And another thing is, this whole thing that I was dealing with, these conventions and the people and all that kind of stuff, I used one name that was very important, Peter Williams Jr., who's from New Jersey, who was a pastor in New Jersey, St. Episcopal Church. First black Episcopal priest. He was also in New York. New York is the freedom, right? His church was burned down. His house was right next door. They burned his house down too, in New York. Why? Because they had got wind. They thought that he had did a wedding ceremony of a black person to a white person. So they burned his church down, destroyed it. He had raised all this money to get the church built and all that kind of stuff. They destroyed it. Now, okay, Professor, what did that have to do with the question there? So my point in saying that is this. One of the things that we do when we look at that story and we understand that, we understand, and they were beating people up and killing people. We understand that. If there's a brutality in New York against free black people, and this was 1834. If we're looking at that kind of brutality towards black people, then we use our imagination. So, well, if this is for free black people, well, what was going on in the South? If free black people, if their body is not protected, if they're not really free, then what does that mean for other people? And the only way we get that is going back and reading this stuff, right? So that's why I said, so our imagination does come in, but the root of it, we go back and look at, well, what were people saying? What were they writing? What were they talking about? Don't take my word for how bad slavery was. Go back and read the people who were in it and what they talked about. Read Frederick Douglass. Read the stories that they shared, right? Am I making sense?
Well, maybe here's the thing, right? Because I hear what you're saying, and I hear going back and looking at what people are writing about. But you've been talking for a while about from 1793, 1843, 1972, debating the same thing over and over again. Why can't someone look at you talking about black people looking at solutions to our problems, engaging in politics, trying to get civil rights legislation passed, and just say, like, look, you crazy, because we went from slavery to Jim Crow to the prison industrial complex. We have these same issues. We are not making progress in the way in which the Gary Convention you were talking about.
Yeah.
So why aren't you just selling us a bill of goods when you were talking about, like, look at kids, solve these problems, get engaged in politics, do federal government or local government. And like, why isn't it all just garbage? We shouldn't vote. We should just like not get involved in it because it will never work.
Because if Richard Allen, who in 1793 challenged Matthew Carey, if Richard Allen was brought back to life, and he had happened just to come in his room, he was like, well, damn, y'all free like that? Right? He was like, wow, right? Then he looked at the girl, y'all can dress like that today? Women in my day couldn't dress like that, right? Some of the things that we talking about, right? So what I'm saying is, problems do exist. But if we really look at it, the struggles that we've had have been successful. They haven't gotten us everything we wanted, but they've been successful, right? The very fact that I'm here, and it's different. And that's the thing that we had, the context that we had to look from. Now, you mentioned Greg Carr. I remember him saying that it is very important. And he said it was funny, it's very important. He did say progress depends on where you start in terms of the timeline, right? So if we start with America, everything looked like progress. But his point was, if we start in Kenya, it don't look like progress. It looks like we're going backward, right? But if we start in America, given the context that we coming in and living in, it's very different. It doesn't mean that there are still things that are just downright brutal and oppressive, i.e. the prison industrial complex, right? i.e. police brutality and new type of lynching of black people. Doesn't mean that those things don't exist. But the things that people were fighting for in the 19th century and debating, some of those things have come to fruition. But some of the things are enduring. And that to me helps us understand even more about this country. Because when we go back and look at the argument for voting rights, and then we look today and still seeing the same problems that we have with voting rights, that's an enduring problem. It's not in the same manner, but it's still an enduring problem. And it tells us something about the country, right? Another thing that we always have to notice too, but that's the very fact that we're working and trying to get things solved. One of the things that we got to understand is other people are working, trying to take it back. And that's one of the things that students always have to understand. There is no period in American history where black people have gotten a victory that a counter to that hasn't come. There's no point. So the biggest victory in the 19th century was the Civil War. W.E.B. Du Bois said that was the largest slave rebellion in this country's history. Yeah, right? So that was a victory. Well, what happened after the Civil War? What happened? How long did Reconstruction last? Reconstruction had victories. Black people get elected to office, right? Black schools are being built. There's a backlash, right? You get the strange fruit. Rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Ku Klux Klan is born in 1866. Civil War ends 1865. Boom, here comes the Ku Klux Klan, 1866. Right? So there's always a backlash, right? And even if we see civil rights movement, black power movement, let's say civil rights movement, Dr. King did assassinate in 1968. If you use 68 or 72 or whatever, or the end of the 60s, King assassinated 68, Richard Nixon is elected, law and order. Black people did all this stuff in the 1960s, you get the rise of the prison industrial complex. Oh, then you get drugs and stuff pumped into our community, right? So there's always a backlash, and that's the thing that we have to understand.
So in that backlash, why doesn't it mean that it's futile?
Because we're here. So the very central question, your ancestor from 1820, if they looked at you, if they, given all the history, if they looked at you in 2022, would they think your situation and what you're fighting against is better than their situation, what they're fighting against? would they think that the conditions we live in and what we're fighting against would, well, let's say it this way, and this is an honest question, and it's a question that we can't answer. Well, we can't answer it. It's something that we can't test. We're just using our imagination. You tell me, would you rather live in 2022 or 1822?
Would it depend on where I live? If I were in prison, no.
No.
If I were a free person in 1822 or someone locked in a prison right now, I'd rather be that free person because they were free. The thing I'm pushing, and I'm pushing really hard on this because this is a line of thought that the students are going to be dealing with for a while, right? If I were a free black person in 1822, or like a person who's in prison right now, who might face getting raped, might face like having to be forced labor.
That's a false equivalency. So you have to say, am I a free black person in 1822 or a free black person in 2022? Am I an incarcerated person in 1822? Or am I enslaved in 1822? Or would I rather be in prison in 1822? Because clearly, if I'd rather be a free black person anytime than incarcerated now. Clearly, right? But the question is, would I rather be incarcerated? And I hate to ask the question, but would I rather be incarcerated than enslaved? It's a different type of slavery. I know it. But would I rather be incarcerated in 2022 than enslaved in 1822?
But is there a fundamental difference? If we're talking about incarceration versus slavery, if we're talking about incarceration versus slavery, doesn't that mean that we ain't got no choices? Like the whole politics
He's asking, is there a political ontology that you think is different?
Okay.
Fundamentally,
somebody like me is saying, I think it ain't. I think
fundamentally, we know that the worldview, the DNA of the United States is still the same, right? Because I would argue that the same thing, and this is the thing that's interesting about this whole process, we're fighting the same battles that we had before. Fundamentally hasn't changed. There's still a section of this society that is committed to the peculiar institution of slavery, just in a different form, right? So we're fighting the same thing, but the way we fight and the way it looks is different. Now, the resources that we have to fight it is different. The freedom, the modicum of freedom that we have is different, right? So it's very different. So to your point, clearly, being incarcerated is a new type of slavery. There's no question about that, right? Say it again.
There's a documentary on Netflix, like you could call it 13
Yeah.
or something. I watched it. It talks like about how incarceration is they're all politically or systematic competing like slavery to enslave black people nowadays. You don't have the right to vote. You can't do the same things that you incarcerated.
I hate trying to compare
Slavery and
incarceration, because I don't want to make it seem like I really think it's better.
Right.
But it's always a however. There's always a however, and it's just context. So, I have a good friend who's doing 20 years in federal prison. He went to high school with me, and I sent him books, and I got him in trouble. Well, he got himself in trouble too. I sent him Blood in the Water. Blood in the Water is about the Attica prison rebellion. He got put in the hole for reading that book. Not only for reading it, but for sharing it with people and getting people fired up. He said they said you were inciting a riot, right? Then I gave him Days of Rage. Days of Rage is a book about the Black Panther Party, the Weather Underground, the Black Liberation Army. So all these things that happened post-60s, the 1970s, and them trying to, start a revolution, right? He got in trouble for that too. They said you're trying to incite, they keep telling him that, right? But my point in saying that is,
where's he incarcerated?
he's been in different places. He's in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Right now he's in Williamsburg. He was in Pennsylvania, but they shipped him out. They shipped him to Williamsburg, South Carolina.
You treat him like he was from,
That's a good example. Because the problem is, he's reading these things, and the people who's reading it with him, they're getting fired up.
and he can speak the language that they can understand.
Right,
He can
exactly.
interpret it.
Exactly. So they reading this stuff and getting fired up and all that kind of stuff.
And it's accessible coming.
And what my point in all that saying is, and I hate doing the comparison, but we're giving them stuff to read. They're able to dialogue. They're able to do, well, that's not even a fair comparison, because people who weren't enslaved read stuff too.
But I think the point was there's a line of argumentation that is very powerful and very prevalent.
He knows what Afro-Pessimism is. I talked to him about it.
All right. But
Go ahead and talk about it. It's okay, Austin.
no, I'm breaking it down because it's a recording and
Promise me
other
that I
people
wasn't
are going to
gonna
do
get
it. No, I'm just saying, right? I got you. But I'm breaking it down so that people who are hearing, like who haven't like got that point, right? So if you believe that based on history and understanding that voting, dealing with the political process, making an attempt to solve these problems is a good and necessary thing. It seems like that is the underlying assumption of your presentation and what you're doing.
As one strategy. So I'm glad you framed it that way, because it's not the only strategy, but it is one. So trying to change public policy is a worthwhile venture, in my estimation. And I had a professor that used to always say, for people who didn't want to vote, because I was one of those people at one time. He said, "Well," he said, "it's going to go on with or without you." Well, he said, the legislation, they want to pass legislation with or without you. Do you want to be involved in the process or not? Because it's going to happen with or without you. So, and your question is very important, because we always have to think in terms of long-term strategies and short-term strategies. Dealing with public policy and issues of voting is a short-term strategy dealing with the here and now. There always has to be a long-term strategy in terms of how do we get to this place called freedom? How do we get to this place called liberation? What's the long-term goal for it, right? And mind you, I never said voting, I never pushed voting. I think voting is important, but voting is also the weakest form of political participation. It's the organizing, it's the debating, it's the protests, it's the pushing for policy changes. All those things are more important than voting. So when we look at the Gary Convention, when we look at the model Gary, I think it's something where students are coming together and they're doing things that are more impactful.
Because there's an overall political process that voting is a part of.
Right.
But that political process of finding solutions to problems, debating about those solutions to problems, like pushing those solutions, that is really where you're centering.
That's where it's at. And that's where it has to be. Let me get her over there coming in.
I was wondering, you had talked about legislation that said that Black people didn't have any rights. How are they able to organize conventions, or how is it not stopped by the government? How are they
Okay, so great question. So now remember, the legislation that said, I should say legislation, the Supreme Court decision that said that Black people had no rights, white people were bound to respect, that's 1857. All the conventions were before that, okay? But even then, the northern states who didn't believe in slavery would not have stopped Black people from organizing conventions or doing anything of that nature. So one of the things that we had to be clear on, Black people had allies. Every white person didn't believe in slavery. There were, again, John Brown is white. Charles Sumner is white. So there were white allies who didn't believe in the institution of slavery. So we always have to remember that.
In the same, line of thinking, so if voting is not about voting itself, but is about some larger political project of like finding solutions. But we have been, going, through this section of the timeline. What solutions do you think so far have met? Because it structurally, right? So our individual experiences, right? Some of us are super privileged, but then there's also, right, this idea that prison, right, is the same type of technology, right, of captivity. So then what solutions, other than the fact that we have different tools, right, to fight than we did before, what better tools or better instances of kind of Black existence, right, how we found?
That's an excellent question. In terms from since the 19th century?
Yeah.
I think our access to education has changed, which is a good thing. But I think the problem that is embedded in that is that it's also produced a middle class that doesn't believe that fundamental change is necessary in society. But that should not take us away from the fact that fighting for education, whether it's at Black colleges or whatever, that should not diminish the fact that that's a victory for us.
But so, if I can push back a little bit, when I came back, I moved around and I came back to New Jersey, I got to go to like the North Teachers Convocation. In the school that I went to in high school, I came back and they can't read. They put up the statistics, they were like, we're doing so well. I was like, when I was in high school, they would have been like, all of you have to go. Obviously, we're not doing something correctly. We would, like at that time, I think they would have preferred to not have the school than to have the literacy rates. So if we have access to education, but the access, like, and I can only imagine like the distinction of someplace like Compton, right, or Chicago, right, that are dealing with Baltimore and dealing with way more students. Like Newark is a big school district, but it's not like one of the biggest, right? So what does that access to? Oftentimes subpar, right? You have your Teach for Americas, you have your people who are not interested in Black education.
I think that that's not a problem simply with education. I think that that's an indicator of the problem with the culture. And I think if we look back at, in the 19th century, education, by and large, was valued. I'm not saying the practice of it they look right, but it was valued. By all communities, people wanted to be educated. Today, education is not valued. The culture doesn't support it. And I'm not talking about Black culture, I'm talking about American culture.
So what is the value of having access to something that the culture doesn't want? How is that a win?
So you have contradictions in it, or you have challenges within it. But the thing in itself isn't a bad thing. But it's the other things that has made it a bad thing, which needs to be addressed. So another, I put it in terms of Dr. King. Dr. King used to always say, we need a revolution of values. And I would argue that he's right. So the values that we have in this culture have changed and transformed. I don't even know if they changed. They maybe even got stronger in a negative way. Those values have pushed a market mentality, which everything is commodified, which has devalued education, right? And not just for Black people, Black, brown, white, everybody, right? Because I see it in college, right? People don't want to read an article, let alone a book, right? So that's it. I mean, it's very problematic. So I think there's a need to understand how the culture has, which was already problematic, how it's gotten worse in terms of this and how that's impacted or is permeated throughout education. So for me, that's where the problem. I wouldn't say, well, education is the problem, or our fight for education is the problem. I wouldn't even say we were wrong on that. I think we were wrong in not understanding the challenge at the level of culture and how that impacts everything. And there's a brilliant thinker named Harold Cruz, who wrote The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And Harold Cruz talked about, he said, what these black activists are missing, the nationalists are missing, are the issue of culture, right? And again, Dr. King talked about it in a different way. But that cultural issue, I think, is where people went wrong and not understanding. Did that answer it?
Oh, it does. It does. But I guess the thing that I guess Austin is trying to. I just learned stuff right now. But I think the point of the line in question is because the distinction between like political, ontological versus the sociological, historical analysis, because this could keep going like for hours of like basically two steps forward, one step forward, two steps back, because I don't in like a like sociological way. This is, I think, just a series of like wicked problems. There's not really a potential solution. And then the debate becomes, is it just a wicked problem where it's hard to find, it's not about a solution, but multifaceted, right, evolving solutions, or does that mean that there is no solution? And that's
well, I mean, I said this at Seton Hall, and I say this all the time. There is no solution without starting and having a new constitution. There's no solution. So without a new constitutional convention, if we're going to live in a multiracial society, if you don't have a new constitutional convention, there's no solution. There's only band-aids, right? If you don't have a total transformation of this culture and society, then there's no solution, right? To me, that doesn't mean that there are things that help people get by day to day. There are things that happen, whether it be legislation passed from the federal government or the state or the local level. There are things that might help people get their bills paid. I never see those things as long-term solutions. I see them as things that might be practical, pragmatic, help people get by day to day, right? And I don't dismiss the value of those things. But fundamentally, unless this whole thing is torn up and start over again, we're not winning.
Well, and that, I think, at least in this question.
All right, so thank you so much, and thank you also for the kids here in terms of the amount of patience as well, because we ran a little long. But
Sorry.
No, that was me. But we appreciated, and also we learned, right? Like the reason why we went long is because we were learning at all times when this was going on. Like the education was invaluable to our coaches, our students, myself. We're going to take a break for about 15 minutes. Eat food, drink, walk around.
Thank you all very much.
And big hand of applause. Thank you. I'm sorry? Oh, no, you could have. Kids, hold on a second. Is anybody who wanted to ask questions who did not? I wanted to talk or engage and did not?
I want y'all to come
I have a question that I wanted to ask.
And Amari, you can do that right now. He's very accessible. Just come talk to him. You could have. I just didn't see you because
So black women were part of the labor market.